All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for our fourth session of Letter Support for Pre-K Leaders. We are excited to continue our series. We thank you for coming back after a long weekend and joining us this afternoon. Our discussion will continue with literacy development and how it relates to 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in the state of North Carolina. And as a reminder, each month we will have 2 opportunities for you to join us. And sessions that are offered in the same month will cover the same content. I am Jessica Fitzgerald. I did not take a moment to introduce myself. I am an early education consultant, and I serve the Northwest region of the state, and we have other consultants with us today, some working behind the scenes. Those of us who are presenting today, Sarah Morrison serving the Southwest region, and then Cameron Almond serving the Piedmont Triad region. As we've reviewed in previous sessions, we want to start with the simple view of reading, and the more and more you hear this, we're going to keep the explanation super short because we know you've probably heard this before. As a reminder, it is a formula, and we look at this as a product. So reading comprehension is a product of decoding and language comprehension, and a deficit in either decoding or language comprehension has a negative effect on later reading comprehension. We also want to revisit Scarborough's reading rope, again broken into language comprehension and word recognition. However, in Scarborough's rope, it's broken down into smaller strands. And those strands work together. Again, any fraying, any instability, any weaknesses inhibit a learner to be able to reach the end goal of being a skilled reader. Throughout our time together, we have been walking through some of the essential components of literacy instruction. We started more with the environment, thinking of print-rich environments that foster literacy. And then we followed those with oral language, vocabulary, phonological awareness, and phonemic awareness. So today, we will share information about ideas about phonics and fluency in the pre-K classroom. And don't panic, that doesn't mean teaching children to read in pre-K. We like to reference page 1 of Letters for Early Childhood Educators. It says, early literacy is not about learning to read in preschool. It is about building the important foundations needed for a smooth transition into early reading and writing in the primary grades. So taking those ideas forward, we'll mention our talking points for today, what our focus is. We'll be discussing some developmentally appropriate practices, and those are sprinkled throughout today's session. We don't have you won't see a section divider about developmentally appropriate practice. And we'll also talk and define fluency related to letter naming. We will define phonics and view some examples. And then we'll also discuss modeling fluency during read alouds. So a couple different versions of fluency you'll see here with preschoolers and our younger learners. To focus our attention and recall for our topics today, we invite you to recall activities or materials, supplies, anything in that realm that you use or observe being used in the classroom to promote letter naming and an understanding that letters represent spoken sounds. We invite you to share some of those in the chat.
All right, so some of them that are coming in are student name charts, letters in the sand and water table, using their names to identify letters and sounds, letter sound puzzles.
I love hearing that we have names. We've talked before about how important it is to connect the first letters that children learn to something that's meaningful to them. And what's more meaningful than their name? So thank you for sharing this. Definitely some multi-sensory activities were included there, and that is great as well. To start today's content, we'll focus on children demonstrating fluency. During the preschool years, this focus should be on letter naming, and that letter naming should be a key instructional focus. Letter naming addresses both accuracy and fluency. So are they able to say the correct letter name, and are they able to name it automatically? Letter naming is included in the word recognition strand when we're looking at that reading rope that we talked about. And you can see a snip of that in the bottom right-hand corner. And the number of letter names children know as they enter kindergarten is the second best individual predictor of reading achievement in primary grades. And that's after phoning segmentation. So the first indicator, the best predictor is if children are able to recognize those individual sounds in words, and the second best is their letter naming ability. On page 134 of our letters manual, it continues by saying, letter name knowledge appears to facilitate letter sound learning, and it aids in developing an understanding of alphabetic principle. A number of properties and characteristics influence children's alphabetic learning, and this is further unpacked in session 9 of letters. We'll also discuss the alphabetic principle later in today's session. So piggybacking off of our first chat response, how does your center or program, school, wherever your environment may look like, teach letter sounds? And not necessarily the materials, but is there a particular scope and sequence or order that you may use? Or is there a structured method to how letters and sounds are taught? Again, please drop that in the chat to share with others and also inform us of your practice. Integrity, Letterland, Foundations Integrity, and Zoo Phonics. So we do have some programs that we're using in some curriculum or curricula that have been adopted maybe, and those may align with your K5 or K3 curriculum as well. So thank you again for sharing. So as you're looking at those as the programs or curriculums you've adopted, or if you haven't adopted one, something that you may be looking into, here are some things to consider. According to the results of a synthesis study, the optimal level of letter knowledge for children entering kindergarten is 18 uppercase letter names and 15 lowercase letter names. We often, in the ones that you dropped in the chat, we didn't see letter of the week this time, but often letter of the week has been used in the name of tradition. Unfortunately, there just isn't empirical research to support its effectiveness, and just thinking that teaching 26 letters at simply one a week takes 26 weeks to get through all of those letters. It does not include much differentiation. It does have a low effect size, and it does not allow for that systematic repeated exposure, which increases the automaticity and accuracy for children over time. So keeping that in mind as you're looking through curriculum or just creating lessons and scopes and sequences on your own. So more about a high yield instructional strategy is included in session 9 of Letters for Early Childhood Educators. There you will learn about teaching through a 6-cycle process. Starting with letter recognition based on names, and then some cycles focus on alphabetical order, those types of things. We do not, due to our limited time today, we don't have time to go through all 6 of those cycles, but you do have access to that through your Letters Early Childhood resources. So for now, we really want the key takeaway to be to plan intentional and explicit instruction with that repeated exposure for children. So we know that letter naming, many of you mentioned sand and multisensory and just associating letter naming with the children's names. And those are all wonderful examples of how we can increase the repetition and the exposure for children in the letters and the names and their names. So we have here a couple examples. We have a magazine junk mail letter sort, and we can, this is an example from the Florida Center for Reading Research, where children simply take old or used magazines and find letters that match a given letter. So if the teacher, that week you're working on H, B, and K, children search for those letters in a magazine or other type of printed material that you may have, cut them out, and then sort those letters, and you can always have conversation about the way that they're formed, about similarities or differences between those letters. Another example that can be used as is or adapted from the Florida Center for Reading Research is this pick, name, and write. So children are picking apples off the tree, looking at the letter formation, writing it on a dry erase board, and then picking another. So this one can be adapted in so many different ways, by themes, by making it a partner game so that children are taking turns and both are writing or one writing. And that just gives them increased opportunity and exposure with those letters. Okay, letter naming development. So using information from letters and teaching strategies gold, we see typical developmental characteristics of when we're looking at letter naming and recognition of letters. We know, just as in typical child development, that receptive language is developed before expressive language. So keeping in mind that children may be able to point to a letter when a letter name is given before they're able to expressively use their language by naming a letter that is pointed to. So an adult may say, show me the letter A, or where do you see the letter A? And the child will be able to do that prior to saying, this is the letter A. So just keeping that typical development in mind when thinking of letter naming. As letters are learned, children will begin to make letter sound connections as well, and this is known as the alphabetic principle, which leads to phonics. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Cam, who is going to talk to us about phonics today.
All right, guys, so we're going to talk a little bit about that shift from phonemic awareness and letter naming to making those connections between the sound symbol relationships. And so we have a quote from Lucy Hart Paulson and Louisa Moats from your Letters Early Childhood Manual. When young children make this important connection between letters and sounds, they transition from the early literacy stage into the early reading and writing stage. The skills required for understanding the alphabetic principle build the foundation for phonics. So what does that mean? So when we're thinking about our phonics instruction, what we're doing is we're creating a relationship or a connection between letters of the written language, our graphemes, so our letter symbols, and the sounds of the spoken language, our phonemes, those little tiniest, smallest pieces of sound that we manipulate in our explicit instruction. And one of the pieces we need to think about here is that very thing of explicit instruction, because if we look on the next slide, we start thinking about our cognitive science. And if we go back, way back into November when we were talking about some of the brain science and phonemic awareness, if we look in this frontal lobe on the left side of your screen, that comes naturally. That's going to be our oral language and where those phonemic awareness instruction pieces lie, where the manipulation of those phonemes are. And what we have to do as teachers is take what comes naturally to children and connect it with some explicit instruction in our temporal lobe with that visual form area of the brain. And so within that visual form area, that's where our letter symbols lie. And that is where that letter naming instruction is going to be housed. And so we have that explicit instruction. Now, as teachers, we have to make the connection for students through systematic explicit instruction using a solid scope and sequence to connect the frontal lobe and those sounds to the temporal lobe and those visual word form areas. As we start building those pieces, that is what is our phonics instruction and what those connections look like between our phonemes and our graphemes, or our sounds and our letters. And so Jessica mentioned that through the alphabetic principle, what we're doing is we're making a transition. We're looking at our letter knowledge and our phonemic awareness. And so when we're thinking about the alphabetic principle, we have been explicitly teaching letter knowledge, just like Jessica described in some of the activities. And then we're also providing explicit instruction through our phonemic awareness. So we're providing sound instruction. And as we transition, we're connecting those two, those letter names and letter symbols, and to our phonemes, our letter sounds. And then we begin manipulating those phonemes, manipulating those letters, blending them together to create whole words. So on the next slide, we have a really quick video from Louisa Moats about what the alphabetic principle is and what it looks like in a pre-K classroom.
The most common confusion is that if the alphabet is taught, the teacher thinks that that's phonemic awareness, or if just rhyming and alliteration are taught, that that's enough phonemic awareness. So a lot of children can come to using letters without
And so Louisa Moats, what she's saying is making that explicit connection. We have to teach children and provide children opportunities to practice those speech sound connections to the letter symbols. So what does that look like in the classroom for you all? That could look like a whole bunch of different things. It could be direct instruction in whole group. It could be direct instruction in small groups or independently, but providing that explicit systematic instruction of making those grapheme and phoneme connection, and then also providing multiple exposures and multiple opportunities for practice. So within Phonics in Action, you guys already hit on a couple of programs that you're using, Creative Curriculum and Letterland and Foundations. All of those are really good that have a strong scope and sequence for that explicit instruction. And so some of the other activities you might see are alphabet maps, like you see in the top left-hand corner. They can be used with capital letters, lowercase letters, a mixture of both letters to provide support in letter naming and sound recognition and start providing those connections. Then you could also use them as placemats during your snack and meal times to be able to include in conversation and support during those transitions. And then choosing lots of different types of materials, whether it's chalk or sand writing, shaving cream, letter walks, Play-Doh to build our letters and then start making those connections as well. And also including opportunities for practice in our play centers. And then Jessica hit on in the letter naming piece, same ideas as you move from just letter naming into our phonics instruction, connecting that sound with that letter, whether it's through plastic letters or magnetic boards, and again, in those sensory tables and play tables as well. Letters Early Childhood spends a lot of time talking about our phonics routines and instructional routines. And helping children scaffold with pictures is a great way to support that. And so you can create them yourselves, or you can purchase these puzzles where the pictures are split so that they begin recognizing words and connecting sounds, and then connecting that letter symbol as well. So we have letter symbol, sound, letter name, letter shape. And so for example, for this one, our first sound in the word bed, we would represent B, with a B and making that visual connection with that phonemic awareness connection. So here's a couple more in thinking through the routine that when we're exposing, guiding, and instructing young children's learning of the alphabet, all the components of letter learning should be used. So when we're thinking through that routine, we're including a name, a shape of the letter, both uppercase and lowercase, the sound that is represented by that letter, a target word, mouth shape. So those articulatory features, when we produce the sound, what is our mouth doing? What is our tongue doing? What is our breath and our voice doing during the production of that sound? And then a method for writing the letter. So we're modeling the creation of that letter. And so the more connections we can make for children, and the more connections children are able to make for words that they are learning, the deeper their understanding becomes. And so for this particular slide, if we're looking at it in instruction, we would represent and model that we can see the letter T, both capital and lowercase. The letter T is represents the sound T. I would emphasize to my students that within that letter T, what my mouth is doing, that it's an unvoiced sound, that it's a stop sound, so my breath is stopping. And then I would have some pictures like a keyword like tooth, so that I can represent that piece and support the scaffold as well. As we move through our instruction, we may end up, as children are becoming more aware and automatic with their letter sound connections, that phoneme grapheme correspondence, we may start to drop some of those scaffolds of the keyword and picture. But initially, we want to make sure that we have those in there. So here we see the teacher, she's providing the scaffold of pointing out the sounds as well as the letters and some other pictures that go along with it, but also letting the children engage in that conversation as well to start building those connections. As we go back through this video, there are some opportunities where children are engaging in a fishing activity. And I really like the rest of this video too, because just like this particular teacher, there are opportunities for the teachers to explain their thinking and what is going on in that classroom.
All right, so now we are going to move into fluency. And we're going to start by talking a little bit about letter naming fluency. And with letter naming fluency, we know that that addresses both accuracy and automaticity. And so when we're reading with children, especially in the preschool year, fluency also addresses prosody, which is reading with expression. So children in a pre-K classroom are not expected to be reading formally. And so therefore they would not, we wouldn't expect them to be reading with expression independently as well. However, as adults and teachers in the classroom, we can model prosody by reading expressively, talking the way the story's characters would talk, making sound effects, varying the pitch of our voice. Really kind of pointing out and highlighting some of those expressive words like shouted and cried and laughed. And what I always love to do too is to call attention to anytime that we're reading and we notice punctuation, such as those exclamation marks and question marks. That's a great opportunity for us to model prosody and reading with expression. And then what this does is give that exposure to children so that they can imitate expression while they are retelling stories and during their play. And another great strategy that goes along with fluency is multiple reads of the same book. Multiple exposures, when we read a book multiple times, is going to increase children's familiarity with the book and the text, and then therefore it gives them more opportunities to practice using expression when they are doing that retell. So you can see there, she had a couple really great examples of her changes in her tone and the way that she was, when she said whisper and she got kind of quiet. So some great examples there of modeling fluency and prosody. And one of the things that we also want to highlight here is how we have to be kind of strategic in preschool about the ways that we use online resources and media and the exposure and the time with screen time with children. And we love this piece because it's a chance for them to have a change in modality and delivery of listening to a story. I know in my classroom, after a while, they've heard me constantly. They hear me. They get used to the way I say things. Sometimes it's just nice to hear somebody else read a story. And so Storyline Online and other resources like this that have other folks reading a story is a great way for them to see some of these skills modeled in action. So just wanted to highlight that for you all today. Some guiding documents that we have available through the Office of Early Learning. So we're going to hit those and which ones align with fluency and alphabet learning and phonics. So literacy instruction standards, you've heard us probably reference this before. The LIS, as they're referred to, are developed for K-12, but there is also a separate set of literacy instruction standards developed specifically for pre-K. And if you'll remember, that is a resource that's specifically designed to support pre-K teachers in the area of literacy. They're written as core practices that teachers will intentionally integrate into their daily instructional plan. Because we know that children require opportunities to engage in high quality early literacy experiences every single day. So what does the LIS tell us about phonics? We know that children do not naturally develop the ability to read. They need that intentional, explicit, systematic instruction. You heard Kim reference that earlier in order for literacy skills to be acquired. And this also includes and happens during the preschool year. Phonics instruction in preschool can utilize developmental practices to inform, pace, and individualize instruction. We can also take into consideration letter characteristics, and that can be used to inform the sequence of instruction along with a multi-component approach. And what does the LIS tell us about fluency? We've hit on fluency in preschool. We know that fluency foundations are developing during the preschool year. Again, those models of fluent reading by the teacher are instrumental in supporting the emerging skills of pace and expression while reading. And when children are exposed to fluent reading, they're able to translate what they see and hear into practice through imitation when they're engaged in some of the other playful reading activities. So we might see them in the dramatic play center acting out a story and might hear them modeling some expression and practicing expression, or over in the book center if they're reenacting a story or a puppet show, things like that. Those are opportunities where children can have to actually apply the use of fluency and proper pace and expression. We are all likely familiar with the North Carolina Foundations for Early Learning and Development, and we want to connect here to that. We want to highlight the unpacking guide that was created by the Office of Learning. There is specific information in the guide connected to the LDC strand that's aligned to our discussion today on alphabet knowledge and the alphabetic principle. So we've included a screenshot here of LDC 12 and its sub-indicators as a reminder of this valuable resource that's available for preschool educators. Additionally, we also want to mention strand LDC 9, which connects to our discussion on fluency. LDC 9I and 9O, you can see there on the screen. That highlights the skill of imitating the special language in storybooks and story dialogue with accuracy and detail. And then finally, we want to highlight the Head Start framework, because the Head Start framework has some specific connections to letter naming and sounds as well. And remembering that letter knowledge is a precursor to the work of phonics. So the progression shown here aligns to the information that we have in letters for early childhood. And we just love that all of these resources have alignment and connection, and it helps to show that triangulation, that even though there are different resources, they are all working together to support each other and working on building those same skills. So they're all meant to be complementary. So as we finish with phonics and fluency, let's think again for a minute about how leaders can support teachers in promoting fluency and phonics practices within the preschool classrooms. So from the information shared during today's session, we would like to invite you to share some ways that you can support phonics and fluency development within your schools or centers. So we're going to pause for a moment, and we invite you to drop an idea in the chat.
We have model it by being a guest reader.
Oh, yes. Or inviting other, that's a great family connection, right? Invite some of those family members in to be guest readers and get to hear those different ways that folks read and present.
Read without expression first, then fix it. I love that idea.
Yes. Great. And that's a great opportunity too to provide that explicit connection to why am I reading it this way, right? Was there an exclamation mark or was there a question mark? So a great connection. Love that.
Read a book constantly and repeat some of them several times. Have students model their expression. Literacy games.
Absolutely. Yes. I love having children model, right? Have them turn and share it with a partner, or say it to a partner with, how would you say this, this way. So love that idea. Those are great, great ideas. We thank you for sharing. We also came up with a few ideas that we would like to share. Ensure that explicit letter naming and phonics instruction is part of your daily classroom schedule. So we want to include that every single day. Very explicit. Children will not gain literacy skills just by enjoying themselves in the classroom every day. So we want to make sure that we're including that and being really explicit. We want to encourage the use of intentional read alouds. And again, somebody just mentioned those repeated reading experiences. That is so helpful because the more that they hear those stories, the multiple exposures allow them to really own that content and that storyline. And that way they can apply some of these other skills the more they hear it and become more familiar with it. It's also important, we'd like to suggest that teachers collaborate together to ensure that the instructional materials they're using are developmentally appropriate and that they follow a scope and sequence. And some of you have mentioned that you already have that built in with the curriculums that you are using. We have one more. We like to encourage teachers to model that accurate and expressive reading during read aloud routines, particularly. But some teachers are just naturally, I think, a little bit more expressive than others, but you can include it during other parts of the day as well, particularly during center play. Or you can get really excited about lunch one day and use some grand expression over whatever's being served. Lots of just regular opportunities throughout the daily schedule. So as a reminder, if you are interested in making any connections to today's content with teachers at your site, school, or in your district, we encourage you to use the Letters for Little Learners, Conversations and Classroom Connections resource. Earlier in today's session, we referenced information from Letters for Early Childhood Session 9, specific to a high-yield instructional cycle for teaching letter names and sounds. And so we invite you to use this resource to dig deeper into that strategy. And if you'll remember, each of the sessions for the Letters for Little Learners can be used as a package, and it's got the facilitator guide and the slide deck included, or you can feel free to pull activities and information that fit your needs and your time constraints. And so finally, we just want to remind you that we do have the following resources on this slide available to you on the NCDPI website to help you as you work on integrating your knowledge of foundational literacy skills development. So we always like to reshare. So on behalf of myself and Jessica and Cam, we would like to sincerely thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.